Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to the main stage. I hope everyone had a fantastic lunch hour and you had a chance to reconnect with colleagues, but more importantly, had a chance to spend a little bit of time outside, having a break, maybe spending a bit of time in nature. So it's an absolute thrill for me to welcome Tony Juniper to the Hopin virtual stage. I'm sure I don't need to tell our delegates, Tony is chair of Natural England. I've lined up a whole series of questions for him, hopefully some unusual things that maybe he doesn't get asked by the papers every day. But more importantly, I've got my trusty tablet here and I'm watching your questions come in on the stage chat. If you can make sure that you've clicked on the tab that says stage, not the main event, then I'll make sure I see your questions, your comments, and we can pose them to Tony as well. So please do get involved and let's really make the most of this time. So a very warm welcome to you, Tony.
Thank you.
Now, whereabouts have we reached you today? Whereabouts in the UK are you?
Well, looking out of the window over there, I'm looking across the Vale down towards Oxford from Whitnam Clumps, which is a couple of little hills with some woodland on top, where there has been found various remains from Iron Age settlements and artifacts from Roman times. And the place I'm sitting in is the Earth Centre, which is an environmental centre here in Oxfordshire. And we have the Natural England board meeting hosted here today and tomorrow. So we'll all be gathering during the course of today and discussing the usual kinds of topics that we ponder at the Natural England board.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you for taking some time out. It's one of the benefits we're finding of this virtual environment, although it's difficult not to get everybody back together. Now, Tony, you will know we've been running Communicate since 2004. There's only a very small handful of people that we've had back for a second time. And it may be lost in the mist of memory, but you joined me on stage 2009, we last met. And that conference was called Valuing the Invaluable. So I've dug out our correspondence back from 2009, and the question that we agreed on for you to talk about then was, is biodiversity getting the attention it deserves? So I'm interested to put that question back to you again, see what you think about that now and how your thoughts might have changed.
Well, this has been, evidently quite a big deal over the past 15 and more years, is the extent to which, as we've navigated this ever more global conversation about environmental questions and the urgency and the scale of them, it's been the climate change question that really did come to the top of the pile when it came to politics, public discourse and media, with the biodiversity question, which is a twin crisis, everyone would agree, kind of lagging quite far behind and much lower profile. And there have been a few reasons for that, and I think one was the way in which the climate change piece was set up from the beginning, from the United Nations process back into the late 80s, as a global technical process with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And until relatively recently, we didn't have anything comparable on biodiversity and ecosystem services, but now we do in the form of the Intergovernmental Platform. And so that has been generating quite a lot of scientific and technical material over the last few years, which has propelled the biodiversity question more into the headlines and in a way that people are beginning to grapple with it more. So that's been good. The other thing which I think has occurred, and this is something that I personally have spent quite a bit of time trying to do, was to make the biodiversity piece, like climate change, a human story. And so if you look at the early days of the climate discussion, it was always very much about impacts on people. So flooding, heat waves, other extreme events, food security, security generally, climate change refugees, climate change justice, what it would mean for our daily lives in terms of less energy, moving to renewables. All of those things, they were very prominent human-facing questions, whereas biodiversity was seen by many as being an ethical question about the protection of animals and plants, with relatively little immediate implications for the welfare of people. Now that has changed, and I think this began with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, various technical processes since then, including the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, most recently the Dasgupta Review here in the UK, which have increasingly portrayed the decline of biodiversity, like climate change, as something which brings great peril to humankind. And so it's been kind of repositioned over the last few years to the point today where these twin crises now are seen as very much about the well-being of human society. And I think that's the reason why the biodiversity piece is caught up alongside that deeper scientific understanding, which is now being projected by that intergovernmental process. And actually, if you look at some of the history of this and media mentions of biodiversity compared with climate change, you see this very big disparity, and hopefully that's now beginning to shift a little bit.
That would be really interesting, I think, for us to pick up at a conference looking at some of that analysis. I don't know if that research exists, but it would definitely be worth us doing a bit of a trend over the life of Communicate, if not more wider. I mean, looking back again, when I think about Communicate 2009, it was also 2 years before we ran our very first session on social media. Communicate 2011, we said there's this new thing called Twitter, and we all need to learn about it. So I'm interested to ask you about social media. How important is it for you personally, professionally, and for Natural England?
Well, I dabble in Twitter a little bit, so get a sense of how that one goes. Facebook I use less, Instagram not really at all. But one can see a complete transformation in the way public discourse is conducted compared with back then, even 2010. It was still the case, 2009, 2010, it was still the case that you had most people getting their day-to-day information through the mass media channels controlled by some editorial group with some level of professional writers who were putting out the news and the features and shaping the debate. And that has changed now. There's been this utter fragmentation of the media space to the point where today everybody can be their own editor and correspondent and putting stuff out into the discussion in a way which, has no boundaries. And that's great at one level in the sense of being able to provide a voice for everyone. But I think it has had really quite big implications for our collective understanding of issues. And, again, that's a double-edged sword. Do we want an editor sitting in a newspaper telling us their particular version of events, or do we much rather have this spectrum of views coming from all of these different sources under citizen control? And you can debate that endlessly in terms of where the kind of the good zone is. But what has happened as a result of this, and not least as a result of the tendency for us to follow and interact with people who are like-minded with us in that new fragmented space, is this very high level of polarization, which now accompanies pretty much every issue. And, some of them non-environmental questions like Brexit, undoubtedly fueled by the social media space, with people putting stuff out there, some of which was untrue, some of which was very angry, deepening the divisions between people. And I joined Natural England in a space where, we are a neutral actor in many cases, based upon evidence rather than an ideological perspective on different subjects. And sitting in that position, you just see this very deep polarization on both sides of the conservation spectrum. One dimension of this would be people concerned about animal rights, and on the other would be sporting interests. And they've never been that close together, but the extent to which they're now highly polarized, with a big chasm between them, making it very hard to have any kind of a constructive conversation. I think that has been fueled by the spaces that, are in that social media dimension. So it's complicated, multi-layered, double-edged swords, good in, the ability to be able to give everyone a voice and share information, but challenging in terms of what it means for the polarization of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for the communicators and programming this conference, this year we have sessions on live streaming and TikTok and all of these programs that, you know, people are having to, in their professional lives, having to kind of be master of all of these platforms and,
Right.
you know, to get the word out. But one more question, kind of looking back in the mists of time before we, you know, look forward. When we met in 2009, you were not chair of Natural England,
No.
and I know that you've done a number of things over that time. You know, it might be great if you could just run us through some of the, you know, the roles and key things that, you know, you'd like to highlight just before that people might not be aware of.
Yeah.
But really also how this transition to being chair of Natural England has been for you personally and professionally.
Yeah. So I've been lucky enough to have a very diverse set of things I've been involved with as a conservationist and sustainability advocate now over 37 years. And actually finding myself here in Oxfordshire today, I'm just kind of reminded of my first role in conservation back in 1984, working in primary schools as a resource to help with conservation and natural history education. Really fantastic years spent down here doing that in some of the small rural schools that lie around here. That then followed, you know, a period working as a conservation scientist with BirdLife International over in Cambridge, and from there moving to Friends of the Earth to run the Tropical Rainforest campaign initially, then to work more broadly on biodiversity, and then ending up as director of Friends of the Earth and vice chair of Friends of the Earth International, departing there in 2008. So I was there for 18 years, quite a long time. And then moving into a period when I did quite a lot of different things simultaneously, and I was helping the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, with some of his sustainability activities, working with the University of Cambridge, where I still am a fellow with the Sustainability Leadership Institute, and then also advising many companies on the sustainability journey, which was fascinating, and also helping a bunch of NGOs as the on the board, and also actually at the end of that period becoming president of the wildlife trusts. And also through that period writing quite a few books. I think I did 8 or 9 in the end, some of them during Friends of the Earth days, but subsequently others written in that time when I had that mixed economy, as it were, and also stood for Parliament as a candidate for the Green Party in 2010 in Cambridge. We did rather well, but we didn't win. And then more latterly, going back to what you might regard as a kind of more structured kind of life, and spending some time with WWF as their campaigns director before being hired to be the chair of Natural England, which happened in 2019. So I've been at Natural England now for 2.5 years. And how has that felt? Well, sometimes it's an interesting question, Savita. I guess, you know, that period at Friends of the Earth, you kind of become slightly more prominent as a campaigner. And I think people thought then, you know, he's a campaigner, and, you know, that kind of becomes the definition. But actually, I've also worked as a scientist, I've worked in education, I've worked as an advisor to business, I've been a writer, helped, you know, with university level programs. And so, you know, campaigning certainly has been a part of it, but I think I define myself not so much as being a campaigner, but being an environmentalist. And being an environmentalist, all of those things you can do. You can be a communicator, a scientist, an advisor, a writer, and also the chair of Natural England, I've discovered. So it feels like, you know, for me, it's not like a big kind of lurch from one thing to another. It's been the same subject all the way through, and just being lucky enough to kind of be reinvented periodically to approach it from a different direction.
Fantastic. And thank you for kind of turning the clock back with us, because I think it's useful and it's very interesting. There's some things in there I didn't know or didn't remember. And I think as people are reading your writing and, you know, your speeches and things, actually knowing that these are some of the experiences that you've had and, you know, some of the paths that you walked, I think can be quite instructive. But we'll turn now to the present. I've got a number of questions still for Tony, but if you're watching, do pop your questions or your comments in the chat function for the stage. Not in the main event, but here on the stage. So Tony, the theme of this year's Communicate is on the road to COP15 and COP26. We're hosting this event in September, not in November when we normally would. And I'm keen that we, you know, pick up some of the earlier things you were saying about connecting nature's recovery and climate change. And we feel that as communicators, this is our big challenge, to kind of draw those two things together and connect the dots. How effectively do you think we're doing that in the communication space?
Well, I think we're doing quite well, actually, on that subject. And, you know, the way that the agenda has shifted, probably over even as short as 3 years, from these two subjects being seen in, you know, completely separate boxes, the decline of nature and degradation of ecosystems on one side, climate change on another, and the two being, in people's minds, utterly divorced, and actually climate change being used as a proxy phrase for all of it, including plastic going into the ocean. You know, for many people, the kind of shorthand of that has become associated with all of the environmental issues. And so it's been slightly confused, compartmentalized at one level, problem that we've had. But now, you know, for all sorts of different good reasons, it's being drawn together. And this actually is reflected in the discourse around the COPs. And, you know, our own Prime Minister a couple of years ago, you know, being very clear about climate change and biodiversity being two sides of the same coin, and that then being reflected in the advocacy of the British government on the global stage and trying to draw together the agendas between COP15 and COP26. And, you know, the way I often think about it is to see three very deep levels of overlap between these two agendas. So one, of course, is the carbon in the atmosphere and the extent to which there would be less of it there if we looked after our peat bogs and our tropical rainforests and coastal ecosystems like seagrass beds. If we can restore all of those, there will be less carbon in the atmosphere. So that's one level of overlap. A second level of overlap is in the extent to which we can adapt to what are now inevitable climate changes. So some of these flood events we've seen in Britain and elsewhere, increasingly people are seeing that actually the state of the environment where the heavy rain falls is as important as the heavy rain. And so peat bogs acting like, you know, rough sponges that slow down the flow of water. Same thing with forests, which permit groundwater recharge, and wetlands, which slow down the flow and help to purify water at the same time. And so that level of adaptation, trees in cities to help reduce the heat island effect, all of these things, which again point to a strong overlap, but in that case about resilience and adaptation. And then the third level of overlap is the extent to which, if we are going to avoid a mass extinction of animals and plants, one of the things we have to do very quickly is to slow down the rate of warming globally. And so if we don't stop the warming, we won't stop the mass extinction. And if we don't stop the mass extinction being caused also by habitat destruction, we can't meet 1.5 degrees because that carbon will be in the atmosphere and not in the ecosystems. And so then you can paint a very vivid picture about how these things are mapping across each other in at least three different ways. And then when you get into the policy, you find actually, well, it's mapping into the policy. How do we prioritize where we put the money for conservation? Where do we prioritize the effort we're putting in to building partnerships? And that's one reason why at Natural England, we've got so much effort going into the recovery of peatlands at the moment. It's hitting a very, you know, combined kind of set of agendas: carbon capture and storage, flood risk reduction, river water purity, biodiversity conservation, and also a public health and well-being dimension, given that many of our blanket bog areas are very popular places for tourism and walking, where people regenerate themselves alongside the regeneration of nature. And so, you know, it has implications as well as a scientific kind of rationale. And I do think we're moving into a space now where this is becoming more understood and being captured in some of the agenda items like nature-based solutions, where people are beginning to talk about how we bring climate and nature together to come with, you know, some set of outcomes. So this is work in progress, but I do think the people who've been communicating this have done quite well, actually, in being able to portray the relationships, and then hopefully, as we go forward, more of what we can do to make those synergies really impactful in how we do conservation.
So, I mean, it's a good moment for me to plug a session we have tomorrow called Partnerships on a Landscape Scale, where we're going to be talking about nature-based solutions, but from a communications angle. And we've actually got Mike Moorcroft from Natural England, and we've given him the challenge of giving us a kind of explanation of nature-based solutions that everyone can understand, because
well,
I think
Mike
there's a feeling Yeah, that we use these terms and we may not understand, you know, the same thing, or we may not be talking about the same thing.
No, exactly. That's right. Even amongst the expert community, I think, you know, people talk about definitions, but Mike will do an excellent job of sharing some of the wisdom that we've accumulated at NE.
Brilliant. Well, that's tomorrow morning. If you're coming back and joining us, no pressure on that, Mike. That's a great segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, which may be one of these definition questions, which was about nature recovery networks. And, you know, I know that this is a big vision for Natural England, a big vision for you personally. But again, from a communications angle, I'm wondering if we're kind of talking with one voice about what they are, what they could be, and how we might do that better.
Yeah, another good question. The Nature Recovery Network idea, I mean, this is something that I was having conversations with in the Wildlife Trust movement during my time as president there, working with some of the key figures. We were thinking through, you know, what do we need for the future? Because we've got sites of special scientific interest, we've got national nature reserves, everything else. And we said, well, we need a national nature recovery network. And this was very much inspired by the thinking that came from Sir John Lawton's 2010 report, Making Space for Nature, which told us that what we have is not adequate in terms of these little fragments and little islands of wildlife habitat. We needed more of them, bigger, better quality and connected. And so that then turned into thinking about, well, what would you do to make that happen? And the answer was, well, create a nature recovery network. And then just before I came to Natural England, that idea appeared in the government's 25-year environment plan, with some numbers behind it, including 500,000 hectares of new habitat outside protected areas to be created over the course of the 25-year plan. And since then, there's been various elaborations of the discussion looking at how we might involve the national parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty, which, you know, many decades ago were designated for beauty and access reasons. And increasingly, we can see a converging agenda with what they were set up to do with what we need to do in the future for nature recovery. And then new measures coming through now in the Environment Bill, including, I think, what could be a transformative new step seen in the establishment of so-called local nature recovery strategies. So we've just been trialling 5 of these across England at county level. We did Cornwall, Northumberland, Cumbria, Greater Manchester and Buckinghamshire to try and work through a process that would enable us to be engaging with stakeholders across the spectrum, water companies, house builders, farmers, landowners, other actors in the landscape, and of course the NGOs, to be coming up with a county level picture of what we need to keep, but critically also what we need to restore in order to be able to create that John Lawton style vision across the entire country of more, bigger, better connected wildlife habitats. And so at Natural England, we've agreed in our strategy that really this is the convergence point for all of the work that we're doing in terms of work we do on the planning and licensing side, what we're doing to enable people to connect more and benefit from nature, what we're doing to ensure the resilience of the existing protected area network and improving its quality, and also what we're doing crucially with agriculture and food production, and bringing all of those different strands of work together to focus around this idea of building this new nature recovery network across the whole of England. So that takes far too long to explain, of course, for any kind of media interview. So finding ways of being able to encapsulate this is quite critical. Our friends at the Wildlife Trust are having a conversation which is very similar, and they refer to the idea of wild belt, which I like very much, and which is another way of looking at it. The general idea, never mind the network bit, the general idea of nature recovery is also one which has enormous power. And, you know, I sometimes say to, you know, various people who are taking a view on these discussions about the environment and what we need to do next, and I point out how we're at an inflection point right now where, you know, for 70 years, we've been focusing on conservation. And the implication of conservation is that you hang on to what's already there. You hang on to the fragments and the remains and the remnants, and you curate them. It's rather like a museum. You have conservationists looking after the ancient relics. We're moving into a new phase now where the phrase nature recovery I think is beginning to quite prominently replace conservation. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that flipping framing. And people who are doing communications for their work, I'm sure will appreciate the difference in the sense of something which is forward-looking and about putting stuff back compared to something that was seen as slightly nostalgic and hanging on to remnants and remains. And this is not to say for a second that those remnants and remains suddenly become less important. Actually, they become more important, because the only way we're going to create that nature recovery network is by repopulating the landscape from those remnants and remains. And so they become much more strategic. They don't become less important. They become more useful than we thought, I guess is how you might look at it.
Fantastic. Well, it would be great to hear from you in the audience. How does that strike you, that kind of move to that language, that positive nature recovery instead of conservation? We've had one comment from Natasha Clark, who I think is at Bristol Water, talking about how we might use animation more in this space to kind of take these complex topics and visual maps and bring them to life. I don't think we've had any questions yet, Tony, which I think is amazing and just allows. Can you believe it? No questions at all. There's a challenge to you, those in the audience, but I've got plenty, so I'm going to take the opportunity. I'm wondering if you can take us kind of inside Natural England and just tell us about some of the work that's happening internally, some of the things you're quite excited or proud about that might not be making it to the newspaper or the media briefing. In the organization?
It's an incredibly diverse organization for people who are not familiar with it, with a range of very big functions. So one is to be the government's advisor on the natural environment. So when policies like the 25-year environment plan are being written, we're there at the table to offer expert advice as to how best to approach those policies. We're also a regulatory body. So we declare national nature reserves and sites of special scientific interest, national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, which have legal ramifications once they're notified and designated. And we're also a government delivery body. And so when government does have a policy, for example, the recovery of peatlands, they will sometimes say to Natural England, would you please turn this policy into action? And so on peatlands at the moment, we're managing a very substantial multi-million-pound grant scheme to pay for works to recover peatlands on behalf of the government. And across those three functions, we have an underpinning scientific base with lots of experts across a whole range of disciplines, not only biological, but also geological, water, air pollution, who are informing all of the work that we do. So it's very diverse and it's touching all sorts of different areas of concern for conservation. One thing I will highlight though, Savita, which is actually on our board agenda this week, is the future of the national nature reserves. And so I don't know, how many people in England even know that we have a series of wonderful places called national nature reserves. They've kind of been rather eclipsed, I think, by the profile of the national parks, these great big assets, wild places where people can go and see rolling hills and everything else. The national nature reserves, more understated, some of them actually very big and very substantial, but less well known. And one of the things we're very excited about at Natural England is the way in which we might use this designation, NNR, National Nature Reserve, that dates back to 1949. And over that period, we now have accumulated about 250 of these places in England. Some of them are very big. The largest is the Wash, that vast area of coastal wetland in East Anglia. And, they are naturally suited to be the building blocks where we take this view of how we go towards, the John Lawton vision, more, bigger, better and connected. And we've already made some steps in this direction, seeing the national nature reserves in the landscape. You can imagine two areas that have been declared maybe for decades, and there's this big bit in the middle there. What can we do about that? Can we reconnect these places through, creating wilder conditions in the spaces between? And we now have some really great experiences under our belt of how this can work. So one program, which is very much this, nature reserve here, nature reserve there. How do we fill in that piece in the middle? We have that underway at the Great Fen, in Cambridgeshire between Woodwalton Fen and Holme Fen, two really wonderful fragments of the old fenland landscape, but isolated. Over time, they will lose their interest if we're not careful, but by reuniting them through re-wetting 30 square kilometres of fenland, we can make a real difference for the future and bring back a lot of wildlife that is missing from that landscape. This is a great example of partnership too, the wildlife trusts, the Environment Agency, ourselves and local authorities working together to bring forward the vision of that restored, re-wetted area of lowland peat. So this is an example from that side of the country. Another one which was recently declared as what we've now called a super national nature reserve is the Purbeck Heaths in Dorset, where we had 3 national nature reserves, 1, 2, 3, dating back the earliest, I believe, to the 1950s. And we put a boundary around all of them to create a really very significant area of lowland heath, with the areas that were between the old national nature reserves now being put into conservation management, fences being taken out, discussions about the reintroduction of beaver there, old forestry plantations being removed. And this is something that Natural England has taken forward in partnership with the RSPB, the Dorset Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the Forestry Commission, private landowners, amphibian and reptile conservation, with that group of partners coming together to be able to put land in to this landscape scale recovery program, which is just rewriting the story of conservation in England at this moment, and really underlining the importance of the national nature reserves in being almost lifeboats with that wildlife that's been kept there over the decades now coming ashore, if you will, and repopulating the land from those remnant areas that were preserved during that period of very heavy pressure on the landscape over, since the middle part of the 20th century. So another one I could point to would be the Avalon Marshes in Somerset, where we have very large scale ambition being set out by a group of partners down there, including RSPB and Somerset Wildlife Trust, working with us in the Environment Agency. And I think for me, this is one of the very exciting elements of the work we're doing at the moment that you probably won't see in the newspapers, is the extent to which, we're looking to harness these wonderful assets that too few people have heard of, to really put a supercharged battery, if you will, behind that idea of the Nature Recovery Network, and to really pump some power into it.
Thank you, Tony. We've had a little rush now of 5 or 6 questions. Tony's being kind of zoomed into our platform, so can't see your questions. So we've got about 12 minutes left. Should we try to get through as many of these as we can? I think that would be great. So let's pick up just a couple about funding. So I'll kind of do 2 together. So the first one says, is the government Natural England ambition for nature recovery networks going to be backed by adequate funding? And the second is, after severe cuts that happened in Natural England several years ago, will the government ever invest more in Natural England and nature so it can grow bigger once again? Those are kind of connected in terms of funding.
No, very much, Savita. So, well, I've been delighted since arriving as chair, and in my first weeks at Natural England, being struck by the crises of resource constraints that we faced. The organisation was being progressively cut back in terms of its budget from 2010 to the point where by 2018-19 it was operating on about half of the budget it had a decade before. And so being able to correct that has been something that the board has been very concerned about, and very happily last year we saw a very helpful increase in our budget, and this year a very significant increase in our budget, amounting to a 47% increase compared with the year before. So I do feel as though we're on the right track in being able to match the government's very good ambitions with the ability to do that delivery job that I described earlier, which Natural England helps government with in some of these questions. But it's not only about Natural England, this is about combining different resources that are being spent across government. And so, for example, can we align what we are seeking to do through some of the budget being spent on flood risk reduction. You know, if some of that is being spent on improving the quality of the land as well as on hard defences, there's an opportunity right there to link nature recovery with the protection of properties. It goes back to what we said earlier about nature-based solutions and investing in some of those in order to achieve another government aim. And as long as we can align that with some of the things I described a moment ago about nature recovery networks, then there's a huge opportunity there. And similarly with the tree planting budget, and you know, I tend to refer to it as woodland establishment rather than tree planting to bring in the idea of natural regeneration. But if we can blend in that very considerable budget, £650 million through the Nature for Climate Fund, if that can also be spent not only on carbon, but also aligning with the Nature Recovery Network, again, a very substantial budget there. And looking to the future, very big concerns being expressed at the moment about river water quality and wastewater treatment. Could we be doing more in the future to be inviting the water companies to be looking at how they might create new wetlands to be part of the Nature Recovery Network at the same time as cleaning up the residual pollution that may exist even in highly treated sewage water. And so all of these different things, if you can stitch them together and get them pointing in the same direction, we probably have more resources than we thought we do. And, you know, I'm struck actually by a conversation I had with Dieter Helm some years ago, who was the chair of the Natural Capital Committee, who pointed out that, you know, in some cases, it's not really a shortage of money that we suffer from. It's really a question of aligning the budgets. And he actually undertook a case study. I'm just looking down at the River Thames Valley right there. I remember Dieter describing a piece of work that was done by the Natural Capital Committee, looking at something like 20 different budgets that were being spent in that catchment, but sometimes in opposition to each other. For example, with agricultural subsidies supporting the release of nitrates and other pollutants into the river that had to be cleaned up by somebody else with a different budget. And so, you know, if only you could put those two budgets together and so divert the different support regimes and the different priorities that were being established for different bodies, you get more for your money in the end. And so alongside this, this request for proper resourcing, one of the things that we've been saying at Natural England to the policy kind of making process is the extent to which we could do so much better if only we could align all of these different pieces. And this, of course, is even without going into some of the very substantial budgets that are being spent by other government streams and private sector money that's being influenced by government in terms of how that's spent, in terms of, for example, future housing. How can we blend that into a nature recovery network using the biodiversity net gain tool? And also how might we be thinking about the future of infrastructure, including green infrastructure, including actually the thing I started with, which is, you know, how you might build flood defences based upon the recreation of natural habitats. So kind of a long-winded answer, but the answer is yes, we do need more money, but we also need to be blending it in with other money that's being spent in a more effective way.
And I think you've inadvertently picked up a couple of comments and questions here. We had a comment from Laura, who works on promoting national parks, talking about engaging bays, CLG, how we can bring them on board, and also kind of off-gem, off-wet, you know, and I think we've kind of picked up some of those. I'm keen to pick up a great question here from Pete, who, on the communication angle, who says, you know, what messages from the environmental NGO sector would precipitate real action from politicians with this conservation to nature recovery kind of challenge that you've set out? How do we make your job easier? It's a nice question.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think the NGOs do a fantastic job in being able to analyse these different policy areas and come forward with good ideas about what to do with them, to be able to bring ideas into the legislative process. And, you know, great success over recent weeks with the new target to halt nature loss by 2030 being inserted into the Environment Bill. For us, as an organisation that is seeking to achieve nature recovery, having a target enshrined in law, of course, is going to be a very good opportunity to go in an orderly way towards the achievement of that goal. And then, the bringing of the popular voice, a lot of what happens on the environmental side, some of it can be quite challenging in terms of people not wanting to change their behavior and not wanting to have to do things differently. And being able to show that there is a massive body of public backing for what we're trying to do is also hugely significant. And the NGOs do a very good job of that too. I guess one thing at the moment which would be worth reflecting on from the NGO perspective is the extent to which, the policy and target work that they do is also linked with some work about how we get adequate resourcing for these priorities. Because on the environmental side, I think too often we assume that the policy will be implemented because it's been adopted, when in fact, the space between the target and its delivery is something different. So we've got the targets now, many of them at least, and government really does want to move on them. But being able to ensure that we have the resources to be able to do that, I think that's something that the NGOs can help with as well.
Another question on the kind of communications side from Kiri, going back to what you said about polarization of opinion. Do you have any ideas how we could help people to work together for nature when they're coming from such different viewpoints?
Yeah, I think, that there are always going to be, quite major disagreements in this space, but also I think we do still need to find ways of making the most of opportunities to cooperate and collaborate. Sometimes it is almost impossible because the world view is utterly different. And, the chasm that exists between some of the campaigners and the sporting interests, probably they're too wide. But for other organisations who are working in that space, maybe there are still more ways in which we might be able to find the ability to discuss and to try and agree some compromises. And that actually requires quite a lot of leadership, especially in big organisations where you have, that spectrum of opinion is actually inside your own organisation. And so being able to have discussions with what to some people are quite controversial sectors or areas of interest, it does require really quite strong leadership to be able to do that. So I can understand why people sometimes are nervous about entering in to some of these discussions because of the internal, never mind the external context. But it's something we have to do. It's not easy, and very often it's also quite difficult to do, at a personal level for many conservationists to enter into a discussion with people that you may have felt you disagreed with at a fundamental level for quite a few years. But actually what I've discovered, and certainly in the role at Natural England, is how nearly everybody has got a very nice human side to them and is prepared to have a conversation if only we can find the conditions to have that. And maybe we start with that and begin with the idea that most people can be and indeed are willing to be constructive, and then see how we get on.
Brilliant. Tony, somehow we're almost out of time. I'm sorry to people we didn't get to all of the questions, but just to finish off in the last kind of 45 seconds or so, I've been asking all of our studio guests, have you got a challenge or a provocation to the 600 environmental communicators who are with us as they're thinking about tomorrow and also going back to the day job on Thursday?
Yeah, well, there are some very considerable challenges out there. Well, I think, yeah, the challenge of how to get beyond polarization and to create progress through cooperation, that is actually a communications challenge, because it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about the role of social media in particular, and also actually mainstream media. Very often you get the attention and the clicks and the likes when a strong view is put there, which often is provocative to the point where other people strongly disagree with it. And I think, quite a lot of communications, it's fallen into the trap of seeing, an argument as the way of making awareness happen. So how do we get awareness without an argument? That's my challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day with the board meeting.
Sure.
I hope it is not another 12 years before you come back and join us at Communicate again.
I'll be back before then, Savita. And actually, I do think, as I recall, that I was there at the very first one in 2004.
Oh, brilliant.
So
you're our triple threat then.
Yeah,
we'll have to make it four.
For my fourth visit whenever you're ready.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks to everyone in the audience for all your comments and chat, and a big thanks to Tony. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.